None of the men practicing Tai Chi in a field by the river are Chinese. An impulse tells me to leave the path that dusts my shoes with cinders and join them. But once I tried these movements and found harmony only in their names. Hands like clouds, white crane spreads wings, search for needle on sea bottom. Behind the men, a leaf drifts along the current. I tell myself it fell from a box elder. I've hiked past stands of those trees beside the creek that feeds this river. And from these green waters, the leaf will spill into a broader brown river. And at the wide bay, where that would empty into the sea, migrating red knots wing down each May from Tierra del Fuego, wing down withered, chest sunken to breastbones, wing down to crack open the husk of horseshoe crabs and gorge bulk up to finish the flight to the tundra, to nest scraped into the frost-hard earth. Throw the loom, flash arms like fans, and fishermen bait their lines with crab, and the colony dwindles, and the shorebirds die off. And the black boys of Philadelphia this summer, one gun down each day. Grasping at Swallow's Tail, a poem by Iain Haley Pollock from his collection of poems, Ghost Like a Place. Good evening. My name is Charles Carr, and welcome to Philly Loves Poetry, a collaboration between the Moonstone Arts Center of Philadelphia and Philly Cam. The focus of our program is to give our audiences the experience of the rich culture of poetry that is in Philadelphia and it comes to Philadelphia. And tonight we have yet another remarkable poet in our series, a gentleman who lived in Philadelphia for several years and taught at Chestnut Hill Academy, but has since moved to New York. Yet Philadelphia continues to claim Iain Haley Pollock as our own. Iain is the author of two poetry collections, Ghosts Like a Place, which was published by Alice James Books in 2018, which was nominated for an NAACP Image Award, and Spit Back a Boy, winner of the 2010 Cave Canem Poetry Prize. Individual poems of Iain have appeared in American Poetry Review, the Baffler, and the New York Times Magazine. A longtime high school English teacher, Iain is the incoming director of the Creative Writing MFA program at Manhattanville College in Purchase, New York. Iain also serves on the editorial advisory board of Slappering Hole Press. Well, welcome, Iain. We're really happy to finally get you on our Philly Loves Poetry.
Yes,
So
yes.
I
Thanks for
wanted,
having me, Charles. I
yeah,
appreciate it.
yeah,
Always good to interact with Philly. I'm glad you all claim me as your own. I
okay,
still claim the city.
great. So I'm going back to the poem I read, "Grasping
Sure.
at Swallow's Tail," which is a remarkable poem in this very compressed space, in this very compressed poem. There's so much that happens in a movement in a very short amount of time. I mean, we start the poem, if people can remember, from men practicing Tai Chi. We move to the voyage of just a leaf in, a river, and then we deal with the birds who are migrating, and we end up with this startling reality that is still probably more apparent than ever in Philadelphia of young black boys being gunned down in the streets. So I wanted to first ask you, how you go about building poems and how you are able to really modulate and change. And is there an end that you're hoping to get by using that particular style?
Yeah, thank you, Charles. I think that's a really perceptive question, and perceptive about a certain style of poem I write. Before I answer, I just want to take a step back, and you sort of alluded to this when you were talking about the violence and the gun violence that happens at the end of the poem. I just want to take a minute out of respect to think. I've been thinking about the city of Philadelphia a lot in the last few days, with the violence on South Street, and just my heart goes out to the folks that died and their family, as well as the people who were there and witnessing it. So the stakes for poetry, I think, are pretty high. You know, the things I'm trying to write about are things happening in the world. I wrote that poem a long time ago, and I think some of the violence and the systems that enable the violence are still in place. So I just wanted to take a moment to recognize that, and it'll come up again when I read poems later. But I think that idea of systems is important to me, and is some of the reason I try to braid together so many different strands, is that I see so much of our world as interconnected. Like, I think there's a movement for racial justice right now, and there's a movement for environmental justice, and both of those were ongoing, and maybe not didn't seem as urgent at the time that I wrote the poem as they are now. But I see those two struggles as interlinked, right? I don't think we can talk about the environment without talking about people and the people who inhabit the environment. And in so much of my thinking, whether it's across time or across these categories that we create for ourselves, I want to try and push us past those boundaries, and creating a series of images that get braided together, I think, is one way that I try to approach that. I also value surprise in poems. There's sometimes when I'm writing a poem where I don't know where I'm headed as I'm drafting, and this is one of those poems. I didn't know that I would quite end up there, but you know, everything sort of worked together, and that's where I pushed the poem in the end. So sometimes I know where I'm going. I have a narrative mode where I have a story and I know what the end of the story will be. I also I live in memory quite a bit, and I'm always interested in the way that memory works and how it's not linear, and it can be associative, and it can make leaps, or the way that it moves is a little circuitous. And I'm interested in trying to replicate that in my poems, because I'm interested when that happens for me and when it happens for other people.
Mm-hmm. Well, the title of your book, Ghost Like a Place, and the quote that you have from Rilke in the very beginning of the book is really really stunning. And I mean, you do replicate this, and the quote from Rilke is, "Even a ghost is like a place. Your glance bumps into it with a sound," and it's from Black Cat. And the structure of your book has used those, we'll use three elements: is ghost, place, sound, or maybe it's in the wrong order. And I'm wondering, and I want to say, you know, there are a lot of books of poetry, when you see the title, you kind of scratch your head and you say, well, I don't know what I'm going to expect from that title. But this title really does reflect the collection of poems in the book very, very well. But the way you have segmented it into those three areas of sound and place, are you know, and ghost, is very, very interesting. Can you speak about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I tried to be intentional with the title, and it was a title I was sort of flirting with. I wrote most of the book when I was living in Philly, and then finished it the first year I was up here in the Hudson Valley. And I think it really, moving away from Philly helped to make concrete some of what I was dealing with. I think in my poems you'll see that I often try to create a clear sense of place. I think place is really important for grounding a poem. I want people to readers to know where they are in the poem, but then to be taken out of the place that you're trying to write about, I think made me appreciate the places more and see their metaphorical possibilities in some way, but just also how special they were. I think you take for granted, like when you're in a routine, you take places for granted and then you leave it and you can sort of see it more clearly somehow, or you see the its meaning more clearly. So that's where the ghost comes in, right? Like I'm haunted by the places I've been, sometimes in a good way and sometimes in you know, the more typical meaning of that word. So I'm often thinking about places where I've been. I had a pretty itinerant childhood. I was in Iowa, DC, Southern California, upstate New York. As an adult, I've bounced around Boston, Syracuse, Philly, and now New York. So I've moved through a lot of locations, and the interplay of the actual place and the memory of the place is interesting to me, and is often a place from which I write. And then I think that as a poet, I got into poetry for story. I'm interested in telling stories through poems, and I love the compression of narrative that can happen in a poem. But I think one thing I've embraced more and more is the sonic quality of poems, and the way that it interacts with music, and the history of poetry and music being intertwined in poetry's origins, right? So I want the sound piece of that spoke to me as well, both in writing about musicians. There's a long, like, sort of collective biography of jazz musicians late in the book, and I'm influenced by music and the tradition of American music, and so I wanted that in there, and I was also just wanting to force myself to ramp up the sonic quality of my poems.
You know, this may sound strange and somewhat off the beaten track as far as, but you know, books of poems strike everybody differently. So when I finished reading your book of poems the second time, somehow the name of Marcel Proust hit me, and the memory of, you know, Swann's Way, which I read a very, very long time ago when I was in college. But somehow the way that you use place as an appellation to invoke all these memories reminds me of things in Proust where he was talking about taste and smell and things like that, as, you know, bringing back the, you know, the phenomenon
Yeah.
of the past to him. And I really felt that in your book, is that very much in your treatment of time specifically, and how you manipulate time, I find very fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, you will hear me butcher French. I
Yeah.
have a poem with a French title that I can't pronounce, which I know is a little pretentious. Which is to say, I think what you're picking up on in my poems is accurate, but I can't say that it's coming out of like a Proustian tradition. Swann's Way is a blind spot for me. But from what I understand, of what happens in the novel, I think you're onto something. But I think the relationship to time that you're discovering, or you're noting, to me comes out of a Black tradition of, I think, of like cultural memory being handed down from generation to generation. So I think that for me as a child, like memories of the Black experience from slavery through the civil rights era, for a man of my generation, were very present to me, because I heard those stories from my mother and from my mother's family, from aunts, in particular. So my sense that, like, the past is never past, I think, comes from that, and that the sort of richness of memory, I think, comes out of that tradition, of that sort of oral tradition of handing down family history and cultural history as well. And so I think that if I had to locate like where my interest in memory comes from, I think it comes from there, and I think that is in contrast to the dominant American culture. I think Americans have short memories. I think it's part of our national character if we're trying to pin something like that down. And I think there are positives to having a short memory, but I think in the current moment, maybe having a short memory is working against us. Or maybe it's that some people have a short memory and other people have a long memory, and like I see tension there in our society, and in the divisiveness that has entered our society. I think there's some of that. Like Tulsa, the Tulsa massacre has been talked about a lot, in the last few years, and I think things like that are very present and meaningful to some people, and other people say like it was 100 years ago, like get over it, right? And I think there's a tension there, and I'm obviously in the first camp, but I want to make clear that the past remains and informs what happens in our lives in the current moment.
Yeah, and it's very present in your book. With the ones just off the top of my head, the poem you wrote about the oystermen who migrated from Maryland to Staten Island, I thought was a marvelous poem. And then the other poem about your being in a cemetery where your grandfather, great grandfather, relatives were buried was very, very, very moving and very profound. And to say to me, yeah, you do very much hold that memory everywhere in these poems. It doesn't escape you. And the one about the oystermen, I just thought was just marvelous. And so I said, I wonder where Iain got that story from. Was it of something in family that happened, or something that he read, but it's a marvelous poem.
Yeah. For that poem, I was actually I sometimes come at issues sideways, and that for me, a lot of this book was written in the wake of like Michael Brown and Eric Garner. And so Eric Garner being from Staten Island, I was writing that poem, and I didn't want to make Eric Garner's story my story, or like colonize his story. But I wanted to speak about it because I felt so, like I was moved by his death, right? So some of it was, a lot of that poem is about my own relationship to American society, but then also sort of informed by what I saw as a pretty senseless death. And then I was just reading about the history of the Black population of Staten Island, and I found this interesting story about oystermen moving from Maryland to Staten Island to create this first large Black population on Staten Island. And I was like, right, these are the histories we don't know, right? Like these are we think American society is what it is now, and we don't realize that we've had this very like fluid population, and we've had different phases that get papered over as history moves on, sort of necessarily, right? Like history is being written right now. It keeps going and going and going, and how do we remember everything? How do we fit everything in? I'm just finishing up a stint as a high school teacher, as you said earlier, and I pity my students who are trying to learn American history, right? They're learning 30 more years of history than I had to in high school, and like how do you fit it all in? I think that's some of the job of my job as a poet, is to like find these stories and make sure that they're in the record somewhere, so that they're not lost from. I mean, they will be lost from textbooks, but that they're somewhere out there in broader society, because textbooks can really functionally only capture so much.
Right? I asked this of most of my poet guests, and I said, what would you like your reader to feel about this book after reading it? Well, I mean, what would be, if you say, somebody read it and you say, well, what did you think of it? What impact did it have? Is there a specific goal, I hate to use that word, that you would hope to achieve in this collection?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm always setting out to engage with like the mutual humanity of my reader. I think one of them, I love reading poems like out in the community, and I gave a reading at Bucks County Community College. It's one of the first readings I gave after my first book came out, and this student came up to me after the reading and said to me this thing that I've hung on to, and I think is like my answer to your question. He, he was Ukrainian, and he had moved here when he was 13, and he was reacting to many of my poems about being mixed race and sometimes feeling between these two binaries that we have of black and white. And he was like, I related to that. Like I understood, like I'm Ukrainian and not Ukrainian. I'm American and not American. Like I could understand what you were saying. And that was one of the most powerful like audience interactions I've ever had, because I worry that like, oh, if you're not mixed race, you don't get my poems, right? Like, if you're not black, you don't get my poems. But I think that a good patient, if I do my job, then I'm engaging the humanity of my readers, and they can see my subjective experience in their own subjective experience, and that builds some commonality between us. I think that some of that is my job, and some of that is the reader's job to have empathy, right, and to finish my poems. Yeah, so I think I want moments like that with other people, where they say like, I'm not a father, but I understand that sort of familial love and obligation that you feel towards your family. I felt that as well.
Yeah, I really feel that, this book surely transcends race. Although race is in it, but it's a much larger scope, that one finds in this book. So I think that for me, you very much succeeded in that. Um, uh, I also ask people that are my guest, because there's so many different answers to this, is what is your discipline and your process as far as writing uh, your poetry? I mean, are there specific, you hear from poets, well, I only write in the morning for 3 hours, or I only stay up late at night,
Yeah.
or I only write a poem when it comes to me, I mean, so it's all over the place. So what is your discipline, Iain?
I think my discipline right now is a lack of discipline.
Uh,
I would put myself in the category like right now I'm writing when moved. Yeah, and I think that's really informing. Like I've loved teaching adolescents, but high school teaching is every day. It's in your face. There's so much that happens, and in the COVID era, especially, it's become so much more than the classroom. It's been about taking care of kids. You know, those stories you read about a mental health crisis among American adolescents. From my, you know, for from the kids I've interacted with from the front lines, like that is absolutely true. Um, so I think it's been harder and harder to like find time to have a regular writing practice in the way that I did when I was living in Philadelphia and before I had children. So I'm hoping that like moving to a creative writing program will help make creative writing more central to my life and what I do. Um, because right now my process is basically I feel moved by something, I jot down, I chicken scratch a quick draft or bang it out really quickly on the keyboard, and then maybe during spring break or winter break or summer break I have a chance to sit down and make sense of these hurriedly scrawled drafts that I have, and I just like to be a little more intentional in my process. I'm going to talk a little later when I read about poetry of the moment. It's something that I've been into recently. I think um, artists need space to react and react quickly to things that happen. So I have a segment of poems there that I'm not worried about being disciplined with those poems, but I think there are, I would like to get back to being a little more intentional in my process. Right now, I tend to like be inspired in the car, repeat poems to myself again and again, which is great for the sonic quality of the poems, and then pull into the parking lot at school and I'm whip out my laptop and I'm writing a poem on my dashboard while my colleagues are staring at me as they walk into school. And it's getting a little old, so I'm hoping to, again, to be more intentional.
So let's go to your, life as a teacher,
Yeah.
life as a teacher of writing and of literature, and of poetry. What is your philosophy or your, let's say, your approach to this is how I approach uh, teaching, and this is how I would approach in helping people write poetry,
Yeah.
and prompting them.
Yeah, I studied with the poet Bruce Smith at Syracuse, and like one thing that I always appreciated about Bruce is like I walked out of his workshop like excited about poetry, excited about the possibilities of poetry, right? And I think I've tried to replicate that when I teach. I've been teaching at the graduate level and at the high school level, and I think that's the most important thing, right? I think there are tangible things you can point to about line breaks and sound and sense aligning, like working on metaphor. I think there's like concrete things you can give students, but I think there's some just intangibles in great writing, right? And I think the way to get writers towards those intangibles is to make sure that they keep writing, right? That they keep experimenting and they keep working, and that they stay hungry and keep building their craft. And I think the way to do that is to make sure that folks are excited, that they see the possibilities of the poem, even while being like tactfully honest about the poem itself. But another mentor of mine is Meg Carney, the poet Meg Carney, and she often reminds the Solstice MFA community that like I'm going to get it wrong, of course, but it's to like sometimes like the compassionate remark is better than the intelligent remark, right? And I think there are times when you could cut down a poem and sound really smart, but being a little bit more compassionate and getting the poet excited about the possibilities of revision is much more effective if you're actually interested in teaching people how to write and are interested in furthering people's writing careers. But I also think you need to see people as human beings, right? That have stories that are distinct from yours, but are still valuable. And like, I don't try to like, I have very distinct views on poetry, but I don't try to force those on my student. I'll be honest about my biases. Like, I tend towards narrative poems or lyrical poems where I understand the dramatic situation very clearly. But I don't force that on my students. I think there are many different paths to a good poem, and so seeing that different poets are going to take different paths to finding the poetry that they want to write, I think is important to me.
That's great. So we can talk about your style and your discipline, but we really want to hear these wonderful poems that you have. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Iain, and let you read your poems, discuss your poems, so our audience can enjoy them.
Thanks so much, Charles, and thanks for the thoughtful questions. It's always fun to chop it up and talk poetry. But yes, the actual poems are ultimately, I think, more interesting than talking about poems. When I read tonight, I wanted to start and end with joy, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot. We live in a really complex time, both in terms of the pandemic and the ongoing search for social justice that we're engaged in, and then recently there's been so much gun violence. I think it's hard to see the duality of things, right, and to see that good things are happening. Even as we go through struggles. And on the flip side, sometimes I feel guilty that good things are happening when there's so much hurt and pain in the world. But I do think we need a healthy dose of both. So I'm gonna start and end with joy. Fountain of the Three Rivers. A young boy, a toddler, rocks on the lip of the fountain in Logan Circle, his mother and father on either side. He's making a mess of an ice cream cone, strawberry, while laughing at the twists and stretches of his father's face. Jamal's in town, and we're watching the boy, and also the upspray of the fountain as it rises through the view of the brownstone facade at Basilica's St. Peter and Paul, its clear story windows set high, its vaulted copper dome oxidized to aqua green. The boy then starts laughing too hard and topples back down toward the fountain's pool, but his mother shoots out her arms and braces him. When she pulls the boy back to sitting, he's laughing with the thrill of falling even harder than before. It's hard not to smile. This little boy, open-mouthed, shaking with laughter, his brown left cheek covered with a broad daub of red-pink ice cream. Later, at the museum, we're standing in the modern and contemporary wing, staring at a Rothko. One of the color fields, not orange, red, yellow, but similar shading on the rectangles. And Jamal says, the colors are vibrating. And I never liked Rothkos until then because, of course, I'd never understood them. And now I love them. And now I'll never be able to stop loving them. So I think the hard part of starting with joy is that I don't want to paper over. And this is like sort of my feelings about Philadelphia. It's like I love the city. It's the place where I felt most myself. It's the place where I still feel most myself. But I'm also very aware of its problems and its issues. So I hope in starting with joy, I'm not overlooking some of like the real hurt and pain that we see in our world, and especially in Philly. And this is a poem, that to me is about like the cycle of gun violence that happens. The book is 4 or 5 years old at this point, so it's an ongoing problem, and I'm hopeful that if we keep speaking up, that changes will be made and we'll be able to break this cycle. An abridged history of American violence. The boys are kicking over garbage cans and smashing car windows with heaves of glass bottles. Time in the pest house of school or remediation on a road crew has moved them to boredom with bare knuckles and stolen knives. Soon, their insecurity will concentrate on the grip of a Glock, till an enemy who a minute before was unknown and not an enemy appears under a streetlight. The provocation will be slight, soft palms hardened to a shove. In days to come, friends of the enemy will strip bark from the few trees they know and graffiti their grief onto the trunks. And the boys, even after the votive jars have filled with rainwater and plastic rose bouquets have somehow wilted in the humidity, the boys will also mourn their killed. In their woe, they will want for a light to slow drag through them, a light like the reflection of sequin or chrome. They will not find it, and they will not find it, until they are discovered face up in a dirt lot where neighbors remember a house a while back was torn down, where now bricks and teeth of glass push up like Indian bones through the soil.
I really have to say the ending of that poem is just so remarkable. The fact that you come back to this lot where once stood a house and you've taken that poem and built that to that end is, I mean, that really struck me, that first poem, the way you ended it. It was really great. I just want to say that.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like you're a really great reader of my poem. You sort of understand what I'm up to, which is always it's always helpful to be seen. It's always lovely to be seen. I appreciate that. This is another poem from that same neighborhood. It wasn't Brewery Town when I moved there. It was sort of on the border of Fairmont and North Philly. I think it's during my time there, it got turned into Brewery Town, so it's that same sort of neighborhood. But this goes all over the place too, and talks about my hate of Renoir. Violets for your furs. Garbage men in this city don't see fit to put the garbage in the garbage truck. And in the streets, the dented bottles and cans spin and roll like the gait of a man clutching a brown sacked beer in his hand. The discount grocer on Girard sells week-old cuts of pork and tins of black beans a day from expiry. And the antique dealer by the bus stop hawks one-eyed dolls and green vases. I haven't once in 8 years seen the store open for business. In Dancing Girl with Castanets, the model for the figure's head, Gabrielle Reynard, is posed with rouge on her cheeks, a garland of indulgent red peonies in her hair. She looks bored, and I know this boredom from Rhea Humphrey's eyes in school when I told her, again, I love you. As for the girl's body, for his gaze, Renoir never paid Georgette Pijot, arms bared in a diaphanous traje de flamenca more Hellenic than Iberian. I can guess now why Rhea never protested in the halls when I'd stare so brazenly at her tits. Will I always want something other than what I have? Which is to wonder, who knows if I ever loved Rhea? Probably not, as maybe the young can never love, or not the young as blindered as I was. Let's agree, Gabrielle. Let's agree, Georgette. I went about it all wrong. The garbage men are back, girls. Bottles and cans, cries the heart. Bottles and cans. Bottles and cans, cries the heart. Bottles and cans. This next poem is a prose poem. So it makes it to the daunting right margin, daunting for us poets. It's one of the longer poems I've written, and it's about going to New York and almost getting thrown off the Amtrak train. Whatever wilderness contained there. A woman, her white curls rolled tight, has twice limped through our train car and cannot find a seat. We have passed the zoo and are cutting through North Philadelphia. She complains to the conductor. She is loud, and we are in the quiet car. The conductor asks for her ticket and inspects it. Her ticket is for this train, not our original train broken down in the station. If you have a ticket for the Keystone, he says, stand up and make room for Vermonter passengers. He says we were told this before we boarded. We were not. Naomi and I could not sit next to each other. She is 4 rows in front of me and across the aisle. She has unpacked her lunch. The conductor is standing over her and sees her ticket. He tells Naomi to stand. I stand and say, I'll give her my seat. I do not act out of kindness for the limping woman. That doesn't matter, he says. All Keystone passengers must give up their seats. He is standing over Naomi. She is gathering her lunch and slow to rise. He insists she leave the seat. We are in the quiet car. The conductor tugs at her elbow and she drops her sandwich. I step toward him and explain that she is pregnant. That doesn't matter, he says. She has the wrong ticket. You were told before you boarded. I say, no, we weren't. Other passengers from the broken down train mumble in agreement. My voice is rising when I say again, she is pregnant. I do not tell him early on, first week of the second trimester. Probably she could make the trip to New York on her feet. She is pregnant, I say. Am I acting to protect her? She is carrying a child. She is not standing, I say. We are in the quiet car. Everyone is staring at me. My jaw clenches. The conductor is a small man. I am not a small man. Naomi is not standing. She is pregnant. I am standing, close to the conductor, over the conductor. My jaw clenches. I'll throw you off at Trenton, he says. Fine with me, I say, but she is pregnant. She is not standing. He says, I'm throwing you off at Trenton. Great, I say, but if I'm getting thrown off, you're getting thrown off, and everybody else is getting thrown off, except her, I say, because she's pregnant and she's not standing. This is not rational. Am I acting to protect her? We are in the quiet car. My jaw clenches. Naomi is looking up at me. I have seen this look before when I have yelled, like a skittish dog. Am I acting to protect her? She is pregnant. She is carrying a child. The conductor is a small man. He is no longer threatening me with Trenton. He is making a semantic argument. You can say she's pregnant, he says, but you can't say that she's not standing. I laugh. I am winning. No, I say, I'm saying she's pregnant and she's not standing. We are in the quiet car. People are staring at me. I'm staring at the conductor. The breath moves fast through the knot in his throat. My jaw clenches. He is a small man. I am winning. He shakes his head. He turns and sidles down the aisle. I have won. When he comes back, he will not look at me. I have won. Naomi is sitting. We are in the quiet car. She is pregnant. Early on. Was I acting to protect her? She is carrying a child. I have won. Brewery Town. This morning, the lovers, who last night were slurring and stumbling, and when I looked out, each gripping the other's taut throat in a clench of callus and nail, each forcing gritted teeth inches from the other's face, sit on their front steps. The woman smokes an idle cigarette. The man lounges 2 steps down from her and leans his head into her lap. Beer cans and husks of blue crab from their cookout scuttle by in the languid breeze. The woman flicks the stub of her cigarette into the street and kisses her man on the forehead. A whir and scrape in the kitchen behind me, a whir and scrape, burrs grating in the coffee grinder that Naomi jolts on. I frown back at her, but don't bother to complain about the racket this time. I'm more interested in the lovers, or I was. They're tender now and tedious. I liked them better when the radio was pumping from their open window and they were clawing out, under the streetlights, the terms of their love. So my mother's family grew up in upstate New York, in a part of upstate New York called the Southern Tier, which is right along the Pennsylvania border. And you referred to this poem earlier. Generations of my family have been buried in what was once a segregated cemetery. It's the old Indian and colored burial ground. And this poem is about going to see my uncle buried in that plot where our family has been buried since the 1830s. Indian and colored burial ground. We buried Uncle Keith in Nondaga Cemetery, the old Indian and colored graveyard where Haleys have been put in the ground since Carlos bought himself free of slavery. A crabapple had just come into flower near Keith's plot. With each breeze, a snow of petals covered the turned-over soil while we told stories. I remembered playing basketball in the driveway. Keith was wall-eyed and crippled by hard living. He didn't hit a shot all afternoon. The best story came from Keith's days working at the VA hospital. One night, his friend set up a corpse to spook him when he walked into his shift at the morgue. Spook he did, back through the door, his high yellow face losing its last traces of color, and didn't come into work till 3 hours later. After the service, I stayed in a flea bag across Route 15 from a train yard. A chain link fence curling off its posts separated a mangy lawn from a break of trees. The lights from Corning shone over the lowering, still bare branches of those trees, and picnic benches rotted on the lawn. They had the emptiness of rooms in a clapboard house where no one will live, after a drifter a dozen years ago butchered a family there. I was glad in the morning when I woke up alive. Yeah, so I think one vein of this book deals with race and history and racial identity. The other thread of the book really deals with fatherhood and contending with what it means to take care of another human being, and also realizing the extent to which I was becoming my own father in some ways. Yeah, so this is a fatherhood poem. It conflates two different places in Philly. Rodef Shalom on Broad Street and Germantown Jewish Center, which I think is actually in Mount Airy, which were two different places where my oldest son was in daycare. Boxwood. The synthesized death rattle of soul music played on the radio while my father drove us to the school where he taught, and I waited to be lined up and let outdoors. At day's end, I was dismissed before he finished with his students. I'd often gather a group of friends and sneak to spy on him. Through a grated cellar window, we watched him in his basement classroom, his hands white with chalk dust, or slapping a wooden pointer against a map we imagined to chart the position of enemy guns, but depicted a world we'd see redrawn within a decade. After we exhausted our espionage, we teetered in the sprawling, low-slung branches of a yew and crushed clear fluid from its red fruit. A row of these evergreens, trimmed square and waist-high, hem the walk into the nursery school at our synagogue. This afternoon, my day of teaching done, when I arrive to pick up my son, he'll want to play on the lawn before I drive him home. He'll find palmfuls of acorns and throw them into the road to see tires mash them to pulp. Or he'll find other boys, and they'll dash with the buckling grace of fawns under two old boxwoods, pruned to small climbing trees. They'll clamber there and hang, and despite all cautions, all scolds, they'll fall, and fall, and fall. So I was at I gave a speech at Rosemont MFA's Lit Life conference a couple months ago. I think maybe it was back in April. And I was talking about poetry of the moment and like the necessity sometimes of art just to react to what it sees and let like issues of craft become secondary to getting something down, to recording something, to bearing witness. And I was writing about the necessity of that. And unfortunately, since that time, I've felt the need to write that poetry of the moment. And the Uvalde shooting has really hit home for me as a father of a fourth grader, as a teacher who runs, has to participate in lockdown drills. So the first day of school after the shooting, I had all of my students just write about how they felt, and I journaled along with them. And this poem came out, and it's a little terrifying to read something raw, but I'm going to let it stand in practicing, in the practicing what I preach department. In some America, a gun. The oak leaves turned maroon, then dried brown. Then, in late autumn, they fell. All winter, I waited for their green return, into early spring. They are green now, outside the classroom window, greener for the day's clear blue scrim of sky. Through the other window, open to the spring, I can hear the younger children screeching on the playing field up the hill. Yesterday, today, tomorrow, in some America, a gun in a child's hand has killed, is killing, will kill other children. Yesterday, the killed children were the age of my youngest child. Today, they are the age of my oldest. Tomorrow, I cannot imagine this. I imagine their eyes dilated with fear or narrow with no capacity to understand. The killer's mind, a hailstorm of anger and confusion. I cannot imagine it. I am sitting in a classroom. The oak outside the window has come back to green. The gun in the child's hand killed teachers too, but mostly children. The killer, the gun in the classroom, mostly they killed children. And something else I think about is, I think sometimes we write or think of poems as comfort and art as comfort. And I worry that it's not capable of being that, and that the only thing that is, or the only way for art to be comfortable is to sort of reflect you back on yourself, so that you understand that your survival is important, that your humanity is important, and that you keep going in some way. And this is a poem written towards that. And it focuses on Fela Kuti, who's a Nigerian musician who was often in conflict with the government and whose mother was killed by government soldiers. Dem kill my mama. Fela Kuti, after soldiers raided his compound and threw his mother from an upper window, carried her coffin to the barrack gates for the reason Mammy Till opened her son's casket and let the world see Emmett's head like a caved-in gourd, his neck burned for bearing the gin fan's mass. I wish I had some comfort for you, but whatever kindnesses we've suffered, the strange men rocking our cars out of the snowbank, the silent neighbor picking up our spilled groceries. Here and now, the sunlight passing through the last days of catalpa leaves and onto the steering wheel cannot bring the shy stutter back to our children's tongues, cannot sit our mothers, feet crossed at their ankles, back in their good burgundy upholstered chairs. I can offer no relief and no return. All I have for you is your own body, larynx still sore with the wailing, shoulders stooped from balancing splintered wood, from carrying on their creased plane that final weight. And I promised to end with joy. So I want to end with a poem about perseverance and pushing through the pandemic. Hopefully it's nearing an end, but if it's not, I know we'll get through this and remember those who didn't. And I apologize for my French, as advertised. Attempts at quarantine. Near the end of my run, before the road turns steeply uphill toward the house, I see a girl alone on her front lawn. The day is beautiful, cloudless and cerulean, the latest in a string of beautiful days. The girl has wound her long black hair into a tight bun and wears brown, plastic framed glasses, not unlike my own, and dances. If she is dancing to music, I can't hear it. But then I don't listen too intently. I want her to be dancing to music only she can hear. I imagine the virus has kept her out of a studio for months. I imagine she has danced only in her basement or to the blue glare of a computer screen, disconnected from the other dancers. Besides plie, I do not have the language of dance to describe the few moves she performs while I run past. And the last one I catch, a cubist discombobulation of limbs, she arches her back until her hand touches the ground and then throws each leg separately over her head in a movement that would, if I attempted it, break into pieces my embrittled body. Whatever I become from here, I always want to be this girl. Dancing, I suppose, yes, dancing while people are dying, not out of callow or callous indifference, but in celebration of the dead. Celebration expressed as survival. Survival expressed as a claimant act of love, an act not native only to me, but practiced until it resides in me, muscle and sinew. An imperfect act that is the only one I can think to do. Dancing. Dancing until the imagined company of dancers spins and bends around me, until the music others cannot hear renders itself visible in my body. Dancing until each passerby believes again in cloudless and cerulean, again in this day and the possibility of the next.
Wow.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Iain, for this time that you've given us and the poems and the conversation. It was really terrific. So this is, once again, to our audience, this is the 6th year of Philly Loves Poetry. And we've really had phenomenal poets that have accepted and have been on this. But this is the Moonstone Arts Center, and this is what the Moonstone Arts Center does in Philadelphia. This is just one specific program. And you have to realize that in a year, Larry, Robin, Moonstone Arts Center, and the various hosts of other sponsor close to 100 readings. And that includes close to 300 poets. And of course, we're lucky now in a way because we do it virtually. But I reach out to our people in our audience and I say, we do this, but we need your continuing support to be able to do that. And so I ask you to go to our moonstoneartscenter.org website and see how you can help us to continue, this kind of program. We're one of a kind, not only in this city, we might be one of a kind in the United States. So again, Iain, I thank you very much. It's a terrific show. And I hope to have you back again sometime soon.
Anytime. I would love it.
Right.
I love Philly and Moonstone.
Okay.